He promised to protect her. Now he's come to destroy her family. A story of forbidden love and devastating betrayal set in a world where duty is a cage and the truth is the only weapon left. Lady Seraphina Vale thought she had lost everything until the man who betrayed her returns as the king's iron wolf, forced to choose between his oath to the crown and the perilous love he still carries for her. If you adore the intense drama of Poldark and the heart-wrenching tension of Bridgerton, you need this story. Subscribe now to follow every twist of their journey. Part 1. The Return of the Iron Wolf. The autumn air at Vale House was thick with the melancholy scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, a fitting perfume for a family in quiet, graceful decline. For 2 years, Lady Seraphina Vale had cultivated a life of elegant resignation in the countryside, watching the colors drain from the world, first from her father's health, then from her brother's prospects, and finally, from the very notion of a safe future. She stood now in the faded grandeur of the library, the low afternoon sun catching the dust motes dancing in the air, contemplating a shelf of first editions when the silence of the old house was violently broken. It was not a gentle sound, but the heavy, deliberate thud of hooves on the gravel drive. Too many, too loud, and utterly uninvited. Seraphina straightened, the slight stoop of weariness instantly vanishing, replaced by the proud, unyielding posture of a noble woman who knew a threat when she heard it. She was no longer the soft, trusting girl who once measured her life by the promise of protection. She was the daughter of a house now accused of treason, and in the absence of her ailing mother, Lady Mirabelle, and her brother, Lord Alaric, she was its quiet, defiant shield. A footman, pale as parchment, stumbled into the room. "Milady, it's the King's Riders." Seraphina merely inclined her head. "Show them in, Thomas, and tell your mistress I shall manage this intrusion myself." Her heart, which had been so dormant, now struck a rapid, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew what King's Riders meant. They did not travel this far merely to extend a royal invitation. They came to demand, to seize, or to destroy. She only prayed they did not carry an arrest warrant for Alaric. She descended the main staircase, her simple wool gown a stark counterpoint to the velvet drapes and gilded console tables of the hall. The riders were already filing in, their presence a stain of steel and cold authority upon the ancestral home. And then, at the head of the company, she saw him. The breath caught so painfully in her throat that for a terrible moment she thought she might choke on the sight. He was a figure forged not of flesh and blood, but of iron and unforgiving resolve. Clad in the severe black and gray uniform of the king's trusted inner council, Lord Elias Drayke was utterly transformed from the boy who had once taught her to ride a pony in this very courtyard. His face, once open and generous, was now a mask of chilling, handsome authority, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed by the weight of unstated burdens. He was known across the realm as the Iron Wolf, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and profound respect, the king's most effective advisor and deadliest commander. He was the man who had risen from humble origins to stand at the right hand of the man who now sought to dismantle her family. He had promised to protect her. Now he had returned as her enemy. Their eyes locked across the expanse of the marble floor, and the intervening years fell away like so much dust. The noise of the men, the shuffling of boots, the low hum of their movements. It all dissolved. There was only the dizzying, impossible recognition between two souls who had once shared a world no one else knew. Seraphina felt her meticulously constructed armor of indifference buckle. A sharp, searing pain shot through her, a blend of grief, fury, and a perilous, unwanted yearning. She had tried to hate him, tried to scrub the memory of his kindness from her mind, but seeing him, so magnificent, so utterly ruthless, made the effort seem a cruel joke. Elias, for his part, looked as if he had just been struck a mortal blow. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the world faltered. His gaze, dark and intense, searched her face, lingering on the delicate curve of her cheek, the fierce pride in her eyes, the very subtle tightening around her mouth that spoke of her enduring pain. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots unnaturally loud on the stone. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to defy the acoustics of the hall. It held the precise, measured cadence of a man giving an order, but underneath, Seraphina heard the faintest, unmistakable tremor of a remembered intimacy. "Lady Seraphina," he said, the very formality of the address, a deeper wound than any casual insult. He extended a stiff roll of parchment, the royal seal a vicious spot of crimson against the white. I carry the king's decree. Seraphina did not move to take it. Your presence, Lord Drake, already conveys the king's intent. Spare me the unpleasantness of the preamble. His mouth tightened, a gesture she knew well from their youth, the sign of a man battling an impossible internal struggle. It is a necessary procedure. He forced the parchment into the hand of her footman, refusing to touch her. The Vale family is commanded to surrender all lands, titles, and holdings to the crown. Your brother, Lord Alaric Vale, stands accused of conspiring with known rebels against His Majesty. These properties are to be confiscated and sealed until the resolution of the charge of high treason. He recited the words as if they were a foreign language, devoid of personal meaning, yet every syllable was a betrayal. Seraphina's initial shock receded, replaced by a surge of pure, luminous fury. She met his gaze, holding it steady, refusing to allow him the slightest victory of her capitulation. Treason, she repeated, her voice perfectly even, yet cutting like polished steel. A convenient charge for a king who tires of old debts. Elias drew a slow, deliberate breath. His knuckles were white where they gripped the hilt of his sword. He clearly wished to look away, to hide behind the authority of his post, but her unwavering gaze held him captive. I have my orders, Seraphina. The use of her given name, uttered in a voice barely above a whisper, was a shocking concession, a dangerous step away from his duty. Orders you execute with such meticulous efficiency, Lord Drake? She countered, her sarcasm a thin, protective veneer over her agony. A man of your loyalty, one so favored by the crown, would not allow a detail to slip. He took one terrible step closer, his eyes suddenly burning with a naked intensity that made her entire body tremble. He lowered his voice so that only she could hear, the sound a ragged confession torn from his very soul. I begged him to spare you, he said, the raw anguish in the declaration a far cry from the polished demeanor of the Iron Wolf. I fought for your exemption, for your mother's sake, for the memory of... He trailed off, unable to complete the phrase, the boy I once was. Seraphina felt a sudden, profound lurch in her chest, the pain of his words overshadowing the pain of her family's plight. But she would not yield. She lifted her chin, the picture of quiet, regal defiance. She leaned in, her voice pitched low so that it would be a whisper only for his ears, a lethal, unforgettable reminder. You promised to protect us, Elias, not destroy us. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. It was a phantom oath resurrected from a shared childhood, an unspoken promise now reduced to ash. Elias flinched as if struck. The hard lines of his face fractured, revealing the deep, suffocating guilt he carried. He looked away then, his resolve finally failing him, and only things enforcer remained, cold and distant. He gave a sharp, curt nod to his men. The house is sealed. Let the inventory begin. Seraphina stood her ground, watching as the Iron Wolf executed the destruction of the house he had once sworn to defend. She was stunned, furious, and yet, beneath the icy armor of her contempt, a tiny, dangerous ember had been rekindled. Elias Drayke was a traitor to her house, but his final, raw words, I begged him to spare you, suggested the boy who loved her was not entirely dead. And that, she realized, with a chilling sense of purpose, might be the single, fragile weapon she had left. Part 2. The Ashes of Oaths. The great halls of Vale House, once echoing with Seraphina's quiet solitude, now felt heavy with the tramp of foreign boots and the chill of official inspection. Lord Elias Drayke had done more than merely serve the king's decree. He had taken up residence, overseeing the meticulous, humiliating process of confiscation. Every piece of silver, every heirloom, every ledger book. Each item was recorded, catalogued, and marked with the royal seal, the visible proof of the Vale family's sudden devastating disgrace. Seraphina moved through her own house like a ghost, her presence a silent, searing protest. She watched him from the shadows of drawing-room doorways and the vast, cold expanse of the dining hall, finding a grim satisfaction in the lines of exhaustion and inner torment etched around his dark eyes. The Iron Wolf might command armies, but he could not command his own guilt. He had quartered himself in the late Lord Vale's small, austere study, using it as his headquarters. The irony was a bitter draught. The man who had risen by turning his back on her family now worked from the very room where her father had taught them both Latin and loyalty. Late one afternoon, While the inventory clerks were busy in the wine cellars, Seraphina sought refuge in the old rose garden. It was a desolate spot in November, the trellises skeletal, the flower beds a tangled mess of thorns and decaying blooms. It was also the place where Elias, all knees and awkward sincerity at 17, had once handed her a half-crushed stolen rose and made his fervent, foolish oath to be her shield. She was tracing the sharp curve of a thorn when she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. She did not need to turn. The air itself had shifted, becoming charged with that particular dangerous density that only his proximity created. "It is too cold for you to be out here, Seraphina," Elias stated, his voice devoid of the formal address he used in the house. It was the voice of the old Elias, clipped with familiar concern. She turned slowly, her expression a mask of exquisite indifference. "I find I prefer the cold, Lord Drayke. It is far more honest than the heat of false devotion." He ignored the barb, his eyes fixed on her pale hands, which were now bleeding slightly from the thorns. "Leave the roses. They're finished for the season." "They are not finished," she countered, her voice low and dangerously steady. "They are merely resting, preparing to return. A far cry from certain men who, once finished, are gone forever." The shadow in his eyes deepened. He stepped closer, and she held her ground, refusing to retreat an inch. "I am here," he said, the word heavy with both meaning and restraint. "I am here, and I am ensuring that the arrangements are managed with dignity. I could have sent a harsher man, Seraphina. You know that." "Dignity?" She laughed, a short, sharp, entirely unamused sound. "You call the dismantling of a noble house, built over 4 centuries, dignity? I call it betrayal." Elias clenched his fists, forcing himself not to reach for her. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. The evidence is irrefutable. Your brother's correspondence with the Northern Separatists was intercepted." "The evidence is false." The statement was so direct, so utterly certain that it halted him. Seraphina had spent the previous night in the old family archive, her fear giving way to sharp investigative focus. She had not found Alaric's treason, but she had found discrepancies. Subtle shifts in the king's own signed mandates regarding land ownership, orders that contradicted one another, all relating to the Vale family's strategic holdings near the northern border. "I have uncovered a truth, Elias," she continued, stepping closer until only a breath of cold air separated them. "The king's accusation stems from falsified documents. The very seals he claims to have intercepted contain handwriting that is too clean, too modern for Alaric's dated style. They were forged. Possibly by one of your own men, perhaps one eager to see the king extend his grasp northwards." His composure finally snapped. "That is a charge of treason against the crown, Seraphina. You speak without evidence and out of bitterness." "And you, my lord, speak out of fear and loyalty to a lie," she shot back. "In that very study, 2 days ago, a clerk catalogued 3 royal warrants. 2 were dated a week before the king's men claimed to have intercepted Alaric's treasonous correspondence. Yet those 2 warrants already laid claim to our northern estates. Tell me, Elias, did you know?" The question was a bullet. She searched his eyes, praying, hoping for a denial, an outrage, a defense of his own honor. Elias's jaw worked, a muscle pulsing near his temple. He did not deny it. He did not confess. He simply looked away, turning his head sharply toward the high gray stone wall, and the single terrible truth was written on his averted gaze. Guilt. His silence was the admission, a confirmation that somewhere within the machinations of the court he had encountered the poisonous truth. Perhaps he hadn't forged the papers, but he had chosen to look past their falsehood in the name of duty. A wave of dizzying, absolute despair washed over her, and then a white-hot spike of indignation. She had held on to the hope, however slender, that the man she remembered still lived beneath the iron wolf. Now she knew he was irrevocably compromised. "Then you are no better than the men who profit from the ruin," she whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion too profound for tears. In a swift, instinctive reaction fueled by 2 years of suppressed pain and this final crushing disappointment, she raised her hand and struck him. The slap was loud in the silence of the dying garden, a shocking, resounding crack that echoed the breaking of their last shared thread of fidelity. The mark of her fingers immediately stood out against his pale, chiseled cheekbone. Elias did not flinch. He did not move to retaliate, nor did he allow his anger to surface. His focus was entirely on her, his dark eyes ablaze with a mixture of fury and agonized longing. Before she could pull her hand back, before she could utter another furious word, he caught her wrist. His grip was firm, inescapable, but not cruel, and his thumb brushed against the delicate pulse point where her blood beat out a frantic rhythm. He held her there, her hands suspended between them, the connection a sudden, shocking transference of heat and tension. The argument was over, replaced by a devastating recognition of what they were. Two people irrevocably bound by a history they could not escape and a present that sought to tear them apart. His breath hitched, and he stared down at her wrist, then up into her eyes, holding it far too long for either a commander or a lady. It was a gesture both possessive and utterly heartbreaking. "If you knew what I've done to keep you alive," he murmured, the words ripped from him, ragged and desperate, a confession of burdens she could not fathom, and sacrifices she would never forgive. He didn't finish the thought, didn't elaborate on the price of her safety or the compromises he had made in the king's service. He merely released her wrist, the warmth instantly receding, leaving her hand feeling cold and strangely empty. He turned on his heel, his form already dissolving into the fog that had begun to roll in from the meadow, transforming the beautiful, dying garden into a cold, desolate wilderness. Seraphina was left alone, clutching her stinging hand, watching the Iron Wolf walk away. She knew he had admitted nothing, but he had looked away. And in that refusal to meet her eyes, and in the devastating forbidden touch of his hand, she had found the first crack in his formidable armor, a crack she knew she had to exploit. Part 3, A Bargain with the Devil. The air in Vale House was now heavy with a sense of suspended animation. The king's men continued their slow, relentless inventory, but Seraphina had found a core of steel in the wreckage of her emotions. Her fury had sharpened into purpose. If Elias Drayke was the sword aimed at her family's throat, she would turn his guilt into a shield. She waited 3 days, allowing the aftermath of their confrontation in the rose garden to fester between them. She knew the slap and the subsequent confession of his sacrifices had wounded him deeply, stirring the vestiges of the bond he believed he had buried. She found her opportunity in the green drawing room, where Elias was reviewing a sheaf of documents late the following evening. The house was quiet, the king's riders asleep in the servants' wing, and only a single oil lamp cast a warm, solitary light over the table. Seraphina entered without preamble, carrying a stack of her father's antique ledgers, a peace offering, or perhaps a carefully placed lure. "Lord Drayke," she began, her tone formal and utterly devoid of emotion, a dangerous weapon in itself. "I have brought the account books for the Northern Holdings. They predate the forgery by at least a year. You will find them quite useful in your inventory." Elias looked up, the exhaustion visible in the harsh lamplight. His eyes were wary, searching for the raw fury he expected, but finding only a chilling, calm professionalism. He rose, a mark of respect he did not extend to his own men, but he remained behind the table, maintaining a safe official distance. "That is appreciated, Lady Seraphina. You may leave them." She laid the books down deliberately, but instead of retreating, she looked him directly in the eye. "I have come not to assist with the inventory, but to propose a bargain." Elias raised an eyebrow, a gesture that was half skepticism, half resignation. "You have nothing to bargain with, save perhaps your continued freedom from the king's gales." "On the contrary, I have my unconditional surrender," she countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "I will publicly concede the forfeiture of the Vale titles and lands. I will ensure my mother cooperates fully, and I will issue no resistance or appeal to the crown." Elias leaned forward, a frown deepening on his brow. "You would do that? After all this?" "For a price," she continued, her voice gaining strength, her courage rekindled by the very risk of the proposal. "I will surrender peacefully if you help me uncover the truth about the treason charges." She saw a flash of the old Elias, the astute, justice-driven young man who had trained with her brother, before the mask of the Iron Wolf clamped down. "You ask me to commit treason against the king whom I serve," he stated, his voice flat with warning, "to become your spy. I ask you to serve the truth, Elias. I ask you to honor the very oath you swore, not to a crown built on lies, but to the concept of protection. Seraphina retorted. The forged documents implicate not just my brother, but your own political rivals, I suspect. You risked your life to keep me alive. Now risk your career to prove my family innocent. A compromise for your conscience, Lord Drake. He refused her, instantly and unequivocally. Impossible. I will not betray the king. Then you will live the rest of your life knowing you destroyed the innocent to serve the guilty, and I will ensure that every courtier, every loyalist, hears of the circumstances surrounding the king's convenient acquisition of our border estates. Even an iron wolf can be crippled by shame. Elias stood motionless, his mind wrestling with the impossible knot of duty and conscience. He looked at Seraphina, standing so proud and unyielding in the candlelight, and saw not the haughty daughter of a rebel, but the last vestige of the honest life he had lost. Her unwavering courage was a mirror to the man he once was, and it shook his loyalty to its core. The minutes stretched, silent and thick with tension. Then, in a barely audible exhale, Elias gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He would help her. That night, well after the guards had settled and the house was swallowed by the deep country silence, Seraphina was in her father's library, the one place Elias had forbidden her to enter after confiscating the family papers. She was reading by a single, carefully shielded candlelight, a volume of historical treaties her father had cherished. A slight, almost imperceptible click broke the stillness. She did not startle. She had been expecting it. The door to the study, which connected to the library via a narrow, concealed passage, opened. Elias entered. He was no longer in his uniform, but in dark, plain clothes, the clothes of a man wishing to disappear. He carried a handful of the confiscated documents he had claimed were irrefutable. Documents she now knew contained the truth of the forgery. They stood mere feet apart, the warm, flickering candlelight illuminating their faces, stripping away the harsh roles they played in the world. The old, familiar bond between them, buried beneath years of separation and betrayal, finally began to resurface. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice husky, his eyes dark with the danger of the moment. "If one of my men were to see—" "They won't," Seraphina replied, her voice soft yet commanding. "I am quite adept at discretion, Elias, a necessary skill for the daughter of an accused traitor." He ignored the subtle bitterness in her tone. He only saw her, the light catching the gold flecks in her brown hair, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the familiar sight of her nose wrinkled in concentration over an ancient text. He was momentarily undone. "I brought the ciphered letters from Alaric," he confessed, laying them on the table. "Study the wax seals. One is demonstrably softer than the rest, a telltale sign of a rushed forging process. I cannot risk analyzing them here, but I can show you where to look." They leaned over the documents together, their shoulders brushing, their hands occasionally overlapping as Seraphina pointed out the subtle inconsistencies in the official script. It was a partnership of intimacy and intellect, a shocking return to the easy camaraderie they had shared as children, now laced with the terrifying knowledge of the betrayal that had come between them. She looked up at him, her heart heavy with the question that had plagued her for years. "Why, Elias? You were ready to forsake your poverty, your background, everything, for your loyalty to my father. What oath did the king extract that was so powerful it turned you into this?" Elias straightened, the intimacy instantly gone, replaced by a profound, terrible despair. He walked toward the dark hearth, staring into the cold, empty stone. "It was not an oath of loyalty to the king," he finally confessed, his voice a broken whisper that carried in the absolute silence of the library. "It was a bond sealed in blood after your father's failed rebellion." Seraphina felt the ground shift beneath her. She had known of her father's short, foolish attempt to rally support against the crown, his hasty arrest and his mysterious quiet release. But the details had always been veiled in secrecy. "Tell me," she demanded, stepping toward him, her hands outstretched, seeking the truth. Elias turned, his face a portrait of the tortured hero, the price of his ambition and his survival laid bare. "After Lord Vale's arrest, the king brought me in. He offered me a choice: public execution for your father, or my unwavering service to the crown in exchange for Lord Vale's quiet exile and the survival of your mother and your brother. The price of the Vale family's continued existence, Seraphina, was me." The confession hung in the air, a devastating realization. Elias had not chosen the king over her. He had chosen the king for her. His power, his title, his very identity as the feared Iron Wolf, it was all a cage, the ransom paid for her family's fall. Her heart, which had been hardened by suspicion and vengeance, suddenly broke. Not because he was guilty, but because he was a victim. He had sacrificed his honor, his freedom, and her love to keep her safe from the king's axe. "You were the price," she whispered, the tears blurring the candlelight. Elias stepped toward her then, closing the distance, his stern resolve finally crumbling. He reached out, not to seize her, but to gently cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I never stopped protecting you, Seraphina," he whispered, the mask gone completely, revealing the truth beneath. "I rose to power because the only way to ensure the king would never come for you again was to become the one man he could not live without. I became the Iron Wolf to keep the dogs from your door." It was a devastating declaration, an act of such impossible, tortured love that it stole her breath. For the first time, she saw him not as her enemy, but as the man bound and sacrificed on her behalf.
"I did it for your family. It was the only way to keep them safe."
And so concludes part 1 of our tumultuous tale. Seraphina has made a bargain with the devil. She knows the truth now. Elias didn't betray her family for ambition, but to save them. But a secret alliance built on old passion and present danger can't last long. Will their fragile bond survive the king's scrutiny? And what happens when their intense, forbidden meetings escalate beyond coded whispers and stolen glances? Join us for part 2, when the storm breaks, the mask cracks, and Elias is forced to choose between the king's command and the woman he's sworn to protect.